A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
During the Corona-19 pandemic, which we've been living through, obviously there's been lots of games about the Corona-19 pandemic. Have you looked at any of these?
Well, you brought that article to my attention about I've forgotten her name, but it's a terrific article about sort of the ethical implications of making a game about the coronavirus, and so since then I've been looking at some games, and it's sort of interesting. There's been if you think about games as just another form of expression, then no surprise there's going to be a lot of games about the coronavirus, because there's been a lot of other kinds of expression about the coronavirus, right? People have written extensively over this last year and a half, all kinds of think pieces about the coronavirus. And games, are another form of expression. So it didn't surprise me much to find out that there are hundreds of them on Steam and probably elsewhere too, probably on the Apple Store. There's probably a whole different set on Google Play. There's probably another set.
Hundreds of them.
Hundreds.
Wow. Okay. So I knew about like 3 or 4, right? But hundreds. Okay. So can we quickly go over some of them?
Yeah.
Can you go ahead and tell us about it?
So sure. So they range from very serious sort of simulation games, where you're actually simulating the spread of the virus. And you have the agency you have is the agency that a government might have to, like, what can we do in this government? And you get to see, and some of those are based on real data, and they're very serious. So they show you their methodology. You can look into that and see how they're creating their simulation.
So that would be like the Corona game.
Yeah, that's like the Corona game. And that one's you can play on the web. It's just a website you can play. It's called Corona Game, and and you can sort of see what you can do. What would you do if you were running a government? And it tracks, the health of the population, but also it also tracks how much you're spending, and it also tracks it estimates the happiness of the population, their willingness to put up with whatever you're doing.
Right, and it's interesting. In that game, it specifically was made by a Czech development team.
That's right, and they were using Czech. Right, and they were using data from the Czech Republic.
Right, including, I think, data about how the pandemic was influencing the social stability and happiness of people, and which all that is so complicated to think about in terms of
so complicated.
Different countries, and the U.S. being maybe even an outlier, and how incredibly difficult that would be. But they're trying to seriously and transparently do all that.
That's right.
And Corona Simulator also, I think, would fall into that, right? So this is another one I looked at. In that one, also, in this case, it seems like you're in charge of the world rather than in charge of a country. Right? Which is more complicated, but the same kind of idea. It's very, very serious. It's a simulator.
That's right. On the other end of the spectrum, you have games like Virus Popper.
Okay.
And in Virus Popper, it seems to be sort of like swatting things out of the air, a VR game where you're swatting things out of the air, and so you're using household implements to swat viruses as they float towards you through the air.
Okay.
Another variant here. There's a this was one of my favorite here. Corona Samurai.
Is that kind of like Fruit Ninja?
It is exactly like Fruit Ninja, except that you're slicing. You're slicing virus-like blobs that are floating at you with your samurai swords, and you're throwing ninja stars at them in a distance.
Okay. All right. This one's for the kids.
This, for kids.
Yeah. All right.
So
Can we do
there's
like
just a wide variety. There's endless runners where you're jumping over viruses. But then there are slightly more serious things, like there's one called it's just called COVID-19 coronavirus, and it's a first person POV. You're inside an apartment and you're living out your coronavirus days. You've got a cat, but you've only got a can of cat food, and you have to like go out and get stuff from the stores, or there's it's just sort of another way of sort of simulating and talking about our experiences as we live through this.
Yeah, it's I was thinking you have to go get toilet paper.
Yeah.
In the beginning of the pandemic. But yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you could have this huge range of games. And, one of the potential things we talked about originally for an episode like this was to do one of our Andy and Shlomo Make a Game, right? Or Design a Game episodes to do a game about the corona epidemic. And it's really kind of interesting at the range of kind of games you can do. And the fact that you potentially could do games that are kind of focused on the psychology of living through it.
Right.
As opposed to just beating it or whatever
right.
that means, because it looks like we're never going to beat it at this point.
And I should also point out that some of these games came out as early as April last year.
As early as I thought May was the earliest.
No,
I knew.
There's some with April dates on them as the original.
Wow.
Right. So these are games that were basically done, or were games that just got reskinned to be coronavirus-y in some way.
Right.
Like I mean, right. So they changed some artwork and then they put it out under a different name, and they were working on some other game that used the same mechanics.
I figured this is the case for a lot of these games.
Yeah, and a lot of these games are very, very simple games with very simple engines, and so it's not surprising that these could come out quite quickly.
Okay. There is one game that came out early that called Coronavirus Attack, and I tried to actually find it on Steam or really find much about it. I read a review on Keen Gamer that essentially said so this game comes out in May 2020. So that's a couple months after things shut down. So pretty early, right? I was thinking very early, and it's essentially, according to King Gamer, got these racial undertones. Everything is very, very anti-Chinese, right? And it's got these political themes in it, like Free Tibet and Release Xinjiang. And this is at a time where, there's this kind of movement against, against China and Chinese people. At the same time, most of the reviews on Steam were positive for it. So, go figure what was actually going on. But it really is interesting to notice. My immediate thought at the time was, wow, number one, this is so soon, and you're blaming someone.
Right.
So soon after this is happening, when we have still so little information, and this game is divisive at a time where, God, if there was any time we needed world unity, right? This is a time for world unity. Of course, this is not to say that we need world unity, instead of the truth.
Right.
But still, this
game does not
warring.
Yeah, this game is not trying to get at any sort of truth. It's just trying to make something fun.
Maybe. Right, or maybe it's an activist game, or maybe it's just expressing frustration, or maybe it's just wants to be racist.
Right.
Again, and I'm not saying it is, because I haven't played it. I can't even find a trailer. But it does lead to the question of, we have this tragedy. And this is a huge, huge tragedy. It's a world-changing event.
Yeah, people lost family members. I mean, some people lost a lot of family members.
Right. I've had plenty of students at this point that lost loved ones. And you're releasing something. Of course, when anything this big happens, we want to say things about it, right? We want to
Right.
create experiences about it. But there's a bunch of risks here. So, some of the risks, and I thought we'd start kind of by talking about the risk and the positive potential. Or let's do positive potential first, because to me, like that part seems really, really great.
Yeah, and in some ways it's probably a little bit easier to talk about too, right?
Sure.
They seem a little bit more like obvious, that on one hand it's kind of like gallows humor, right? It's a way for us to be working our way through the grief that we're experiencing through laughter.
Sure. It's even as silly as whatever the Corona samurai, right?
Exactly.
Slicing through the Corona. I mean, that's ridiculous, but in some ways, it's like a way of a lot of these are ways of fighting back, which are not really fighting back, but at least gives us a sense of some sort of agency, right? In this, or letting out frustration, or I mean, through all these simulations, people can learn about the complexities of what governments need to go through.
Right.
Right. And by playing maybe empathy games of people who are, let's say, stuck at home. I found out yesterday that one of our friends had been essentially stuck at home for the last 2 years. She's immunocompromised and can't get the vaccine.
Oof.
And she literally doesn't sound like she's left her apartment for the last 2 years.
Right.
And, to have an empathy game that kind of connects with that somehow, right? Like the one with the cat that you were talking about, right? There's a lot of potential positives here, right? So I think a lot of reasons for making a game like this. At the same time, right? As far as the risks go, right? Certainly with the simulations, maybe you're miseducating the public,
right,
about how things go. Maybe you're, the audience is going to be seeing a very, very oversimplified picture and be upset and frustrated at why can't we do this? I mean, I just did this. I just played Corona Simulator and I solved it in 15 minutes. Right. Why can't our stupid government do it?
Right. But so interestingly, like that game particularly, there were moments in that game that you didn't have any control over. And I thought that those were the most interesting moments because they were all moments where anti-vaccine. They were anti-vaccine sentiments.
Right. So
that were popping up. Periodically moments. There would be moments of anti-vaccine sentiment would come up.
You try to run a PR campaign to get people vaccinated, right? And luck of the draw, it doesn't work. Anti-vax people, conspiracy theories, right? Kind of win the day there, and and I thought that was great because you're making the right move, but the reality is more complicated than that.
Right. And I also thought that the synopsis at the end, when they sort of at the end of when you get to the end of the simulation, which was summer of 2021, they basically write up, here's how much money you've spent as compared to the Czech budget. I ended up spending almost 2/3 of a 1 year's budget. And over the course of 2 years.
Right. Because you can essentially spend money to keep the people happy. Right.
You can basically subsidize, like the U.S. did for many years. They subsidize people's employment.
Right.
You can subsidize services.
All that stuff, right? But by the way, so this isn't Corona Simulator. This is the Corona game.
This is the Corona game, right.
But and another thing to really like about it, so that you get to kind of get this big picture at the end and see how things fit together. I also really like their transparency about how it is that they're coming up with everything.
Yeah.
And here's our math, and it wasn't like a 100% transparent because I mean, I don't know if you really want to give exactly here's the specific formulas we're using, but they give a lot of information about what they were trying to do, and they had a disclaimer about essentially this isn't realistic. This is the best we could do.
Right. They had a disclaimer saying this is of course simplified. There are many more factors that would go into the reality of this. that we were
Right.
just not able to incorporate.
Right. And again, notice, right, this is to essentially alleviate the risk of this potential for miseducation that anything about the real world can have, right, where you're
Right.
miseducating someone. And so I was thinking, in terms of just broad concerns, dividing the population, creating fear, creating
Mhm.
frustration with the government, maybe helping to create social instability in some way. Of course, this was in the beginning of pandemic when the Chinese government banned Plague Inc., right, which
Mhm.
was popular in China, right,
Mhm.
just because it was about pandemics. Right.
Right.
It didn't want it. I think the idea was it didn't want it scaring the public. Of course, it was still in the rest of the world, and
Right.
it's not like the rest of the world panicked, in some
Right.
big way.
And the Chinese government is very wary of anything that the population might use as a way of communicating any sort of dissatisfaction with the government.
Right. Right. So yeah, in Plague Inc., you get, I think, you're fighting you're fighting a pandemic, right?
Right.
So maybe you're questioning what the government is doing, right, compared to what you're doing. Okay. So I thought we'd take this and essentially, I've been looking for an episode where we could do something that I do in my classes. I've done this for years.
Mhm.
So essentially, back in, God, I don't know, 2008 maybe, I was working at the USC Marshall School of Business, and I was coming up with kind of a games or simulations for teaching business ethics. And I wanted to do something on I think at the time it was marketing.
Mhm.
And normally, and as we do in most of our episodes, right, we just present questions for thought, right?
Mhm.
And that's the way kind of I'm used to working, right? They're all open ended, but the business school wanted something more like actionable, right? They said, look, our students want to know. They want a step by step. Here's how you make like an ethical decision. And as a philosopher, I'm like, we don't do that. So, but we had to do that.
Well,
So
you kind of do. I mean,
we kind of do, right? So utilitarianism has, like, let's say a specific process, but typically and in the realm of applied ethics, which is kind of what we do in this show,
Mhm.
we kind of take ethics and we apply them to practical problems. Typically, you weigh things. You kind of weigh different reasons.
Right.
But the business school wanted this, so I got together with Paul Adler, who was a professor of management, really great guy, and we came up with what we call the ABC decision-making model, ethical decision-making model. Okay? And I've been using it. I used it with my business students, with my medical students, and I use it now with my ethics, with my game design students.
Right.
Essentially,
Have you published this? Because it sounds like something that for a certain market would be huge.
I don't know. I haven't. It's in my
your book. It's in your book.
It's in my book. So whenever that gets published.
So soon.
So so the idea with all this, so when we do it, let's say with my game design students, is when you do need to make an ethical choice, how do you do it,
Mhm.
right? And most of us really don't know how to begin. So
Right. Here, I can tell you how I would think about doing it, and I would lean heavily. I would go back and think heavily about my core values, and use those as a lens for the decision. Right. Like.
Okay. And notice that makes sense, right? You think about what are the things you care about, what's
Mhm.
important to you, how do you maintain your integrity by living up to your values, by creating something that matches your values,
Yeah.
right? But which is
different? Is that different than the way than your ABC?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Oh, that's
it's interesting, right? Because
I'm fascinated now to find a different way.
what if your values is I want to make a shit ton of money, and fuck everybody else. And yeah,
makes the decision easy.
I'm totally racist. I want my game to reflect that, right? So here's essentially the way we do it, and I thought we'd kind of we'd walk step by step through this by thinking about how would we make like a coronavirus game, and we're not going to design the game. We're just going to preliminarily think through it.
Okay, that
Okay,
sounds great.
so-
This is going to be fascinating.
Cool. So the first step is essentially like any smart decision, you want to gather the relevant facts.
Okay.
Right? You don't want to make it's irresponsible. And notice that the whole idea here is you're making a responsible ethical decision.
Okay.
Right? There may be different options here, and there will be different options here, and different people might choose different options. But the idea is if you go through this process, you're being responsible about it.
Right.
Okay? Okay, so what are the relevant facts that we need to consider when it comes to making a game about the corona pandemic?
You go to the various stakeholders.
Before we get to the stakeholders, right? So before we get to this, and we'll talk about the stakeholders. But
Well, I mean, I would go to them first to find out where I needed to find out the relevant information.
sometimes I go back and forth,
Okay.
right? So very often, I found that usually starting with facts and having the facts help you identify the stakeholders
Yes.
tends to be more productive.
Tends to work a little bit better. Okay, that makes sense.
But because you're gonna need, you're gonna need your for the first part for awareness, you're gonna need your relevant facts. You're gonna need your stakeholders. You're gonna need the stakes that those stakeholders have.
Right.
And you're going to need to think about your obligations and people's rights. And that will be like a general awareness, and then options will be kind of our last one there before we move on to the next part.
Okay.
So when I think about relevant facts, would be something like, the number of people that have so far died.
Right.
Right. The fact that this has been, a traumatic worldwide event that is still ongoing.
Right. Yes.
I noticed that it's still ongoing is obviously very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. The fact that we still don't know exactly how it started, and that there's certainly a lot of controversy about how it started, along with conspiracy theories about how it started.
Yes, although if we don't know, do we? How much weight do you put on things that you don't know? And honestly, don't really matter, because
if they don't matter, none. If you don't
Right.
know, but it matters that you don't know, then it's relevant.
if it matters to some
Right.
people, but you can look at it and go, well, those people are
Potentially, right?
know.
So look at look at all the conspiracy theories about people who believe like this came out of a lab in Wuhan, right? Or
Right.
the Chinese people who have been told that this came out of a lab in the U.S.
right,
Or the Russians people who believe that this came out of a lab in Russia.
right,
Right? You might say, look, those people don't matter, right? Because that's just crazy bullshit. Those are just conspiracy theories. But if enough of them believe it, I would think that you want to at least take it into the context. So let's say your game might not want to, let's say, have a conspiracy theory within it that might
Right.
connect with them and validate them in some way.
right.
All right. Besides that, right? I think it's important to kind of think about the current controversies. For example, the idea of whether masks should be mandatory. The question of long term, is there really a solution? The fact that there's an anti-vaccine movement. All those kinds of things, I think, would go into kind of relevant facts.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything that you think would go into?
Yeah, like the confidence that the scientific community have about what they know about the coronavirus.
Okay.
So because that community is is science. So of course everybody has there are theories, and then theories get backed up by experiment and by data, and either
Right.
become fact or become working theories. And so there was a lot of time during the first 6 months of this that it was all working theory.
Right. And so let's say growing confidence, and even today, as I'm waiting for the vaccines to be eventually approved for kids under 12 for my son.
Right.
There's a question, how confident can they be, right?
Right.
What is the current scientific consensus, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
to me, the changing ideas of scientific consensus for various solution that seems like an important fact.
Yep.
Also, another one is global inequality in terms of economic inequality
Right.
is a really really big deal here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Or even within the nation, right? The inequality of inaccessibility of health services in some places.
Yes, yeah, and
Um,
I think right that really works as well, right?
in
Globally, it's just much more pronounced,
in the American
right?
South, it's they've been struggling to keep hospitals staffed for 20 years, and I didn't realize this until I was reading about these things in through the lens of what's happening now with COVID. But they've
Right.
actually been having a hard time keeping nursing staff for 20 years now. It's been Mississippi and Alabama have had this huge problem.
Okay, let's not get too
Yeah,
distracted.
right. But but that feeds directly into available beds, right? Which is a very important thing to understand.
Right. So available beds has been a big deal, but also this idea of how much can your government really do for you?
Right.
Right. And it's interesting. A lot of these games kind of assume you have the same amount of power as a global manager over, Sudan as you would over, Germany.
Right.
When the reality is so different. I mean,
Yeah.
this pandemic is going to. And another relevant fact is this is a global pandemic with mutating strains that, as long as any part of the world has hotspots, are going to mutate fast and affect the rest of the world,
Right.
right? To some degree, right? And
Right.
this part again, right? So, okay, so these would
Yeah.
be like the relevant facts. And
Yep. Okay.
then we got our stakeholders, and stakeholders. We're making a game. We are the game studio, right? Who might be affected by our game?
Right. And part of that depends on who our game is for. So we have to start thinking about our market.
Uh,
Like
okay,
if for example we're making a game for kids,
mhm.
then we have to think about their parents. So with children's games you have a different way of there's a lot of different ways you have to think about how things are presented, the stakeholders of the people who are caregivers for their children.
Right. Though it's interesting in this case, I would say that unusually, virtually, you have to think of people's families, not just the player, but also their families, because whatever the player is walking away from, given that our families are connected to each other and are our first point of contact, and the chances of us affecting our family members when it comes to the virus, it seems like a particularly big deal here. So I
Yeah.
would say the player and the family, are both stakeholders. I would add to that, your local community,
Yep.
depending on if the game, if the game is serious enough to get you to impact the community in some way. Maybe your nation, if we extend it that far.
Right.
The game studio is always itself a stakeholder,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, you're investing time and money in it. You
Right.
got people with jobs on the line,
That's right.
Right.
You're investors.
right? You're investors, right? If
Yes.
assuming you have investors,
Right.
right? Okay, so all of these are going to be stakeholders, right? Potentially, we could extend it. Might say, doctors or patients, or we might do specific things like people who have had family members die from corona, right? Might be a kind of specific stakeholder to consider,
Right.
right?
Right.
And then for each of these, we kind of look at, so what are the stakes, right? What do they have at stake, right? So for the game studios, it's pretty easy, right? You essentially have your reputation and money at stake,
Mm-hmm.
and jobs for your employees. For the investors, right? It's their money. For the players, you get things like having a good time, learning something new,
Mm-hmm.
right? Becoming misinformed about something,
Right.
right? spreading spreading misinformation might impact a larger community. Maybe that's not exactly the stakeholder.
Although I think there's
Right,
probably a
right.
stakeholder in the people who are communicating information about the COVID, and the scientific information. The people who are actually trying to do outreach and trying to provide the correct information are a kind of stakeholder that you want to think about.
Sure, though. God,
You might even need to get them involved directly in your let them provide feedback and context for the material that you're creating.
that's an interesting idea, though. Notice it might depend on what kind of game we're making.
Right.
Right? Because if we're making like, COVID Samurai, right, we don't need to do that, right? But if
Right.
we're making a game that is an empathy game simulating what it's like to be locked in,
Right.
because you're, immunocompromised,
Mhm.
then something like that, right, might
Yeah,
make
because you
for a
want to
good
get
idea.
you want to get those details right, so that the
Right.
people who that you're trying to empathize with actually relate to it. Even the sillier games, like there's the one where it's basically a tower defense game set in a supermarket. You're using cleansing products and things like that to defeat the coronavirus creeps as they're marching in on you. You want to make sure that you're actually using the right cleaning products.
Or that cleaning products actually make a difference,
Right.
because if corona just transfers through through the air rather than through surfaces, you're creating misinformation,
Right.
right, about that, right? And some of the things that we're doing, there are some things that people are doing with coronavirus just because it makes other people feel safe, even though it doesn't do anything, and it itself could create potential misinformation. So, okay, so we got our, we think about the stakes of, let's say, people who lost family members,
Mm-hmm.
right? Their psychological health, right,
Yep.
could be dramatically impacted by this, especially if it's a silly game and you're making fun of something that literally was life and death, or incredibly tragic for them.
Mm-hmm.
There's again, any kind of division, for if we're looking at society as a stakeholder. Are you essentially causing social friction in some way? How is that going to affect society? What does society have at stake here, where society could have essentially stability at stake, right? Social relationship could be at stake, right? Families can be either united or split apart by this kind of stuff.
Right.
So, and of course, maybe the biggest stake of all potentially is more people could get COVID or not get COVID,
Right.
right?
Based on, but I mean, some of that is really sort of tertiary to what we're doing. We're just making a game.
Right. And though, and again, notice we haven't thought yet about even what kind of game,
Right.
right? And that part really matters. If you're going to make a game like the Corona game where you're creating a simulation, maybe that simulation really could affect the way people act, the way people vote, the number of people dying, right? The kind of policies being supported. Especially if a game like that gets really popular,
Right.
right? But again, if you're making Corona Samurai, that's not going to be an issue,
Right.
right?
Unless, I mean, in some ways, the more flippant you are about it, the more likely you are to create friction in your family. People who want you to be much more serious about the way
Sure.
that you think about the people who have died and their other family members who have died or whatever.
Presuming that there's people in your family that take it seriously.
Right. Right. But
Of
we don't, I
course,
mean, we don't
the
know,
more
right?
Right, and this is right, and it's interesting because the more seriously you take it, and if your people in your family are really flippant about it, that has the potential for social friction too,
Yeah.
right? And social friction might not be the most important stake.
Right.
Right.
Right. I mean, I think it's quite small, honestly.
I don't. I think it's really big.
Yeah.
But it might not be as big as people's lives.
Right. We have
Right.
not,
Or-
I don't know that we've ever seen a game, historically, any game create enough social friction to matter.
Okay, so let's move on to the next part, right? So we've
Okay.
kind of looked at these things. The next part is any rights or obligations involved here, right? So we can, typically I kind of have them do per stakeholder. So if we start with the game studios, right? Game studios have a right to make, they have a right to make a game that would essentially express their creativity, make the
Yep.
money, right?
Yep.
It's not a complete total right that outweighs every other potential right, but these are rights that they generally have.
Right.
Right, players generally have a right to play games, right? But then we get into kind of a I don't know if there's any other rights here. It's interesting. Like, does society have a right not to have someone spread misinformation, for example?
I mean, yes. To a certain degree, yes. It depends on how on how you present the information. There are. I mean, if we're talking about rights, we're talking about legal stuff, right?
No, moral rights.
Moral rights. Moral rights. They absolutely have a right to correct information.
Well, I don't know if I would kind of put
I
have
the right to say whatever I want, but you have the right to correct information, and that's why there is any conflict at all on this, right?
Well,
those are rights that are in conflict.
If I have a right, you have the obligation to essentially respect my right, which means you can't say what you want to say if it is misinformation. So that's the way that would work, right?
Okay.
I prefer to kind of think about it, and I don't know if it's really different. There's something about I don't really like this idea of you have the right to. I mean, I would say you have a right to correct information from the government or from responsible sources, but I prefer thinking about it at least as the game designer. You have the obligation not to knowingly or negligently misinform or miseducate your audience.
Sure.
Right? Now, mind you, again, if we go to Samurai COVID, you're not really worried about misinforming your audience.
I'm not trying to inform my audience of anything.
Right. But if you're doing that corona attack or whatever, coronavirus attack, notice it's even attack might mean that this is, if you're suggesting that the Chinese orchestrated this as an attack, right?
Right. There's another one that's like coronavirus zombie attack.
Right. But again, right, we don't need to worry about that one, right?
Right.
But this idea of having an obligation not to knowingly misinform or negligently, and again, the negligence part is going to be important, right? If you're like, yeah, I didn't do the research, I don't know, I just put some information out there, right? I would say you're being negligent. You should really know that this could misinform people and lead to problems.
Right, but I mean, the ultimate goal, like if you take that to its ultimate point, anytime that you make a game about anything that's real, you have this. What you're saying is you would have this obligation.
You do,
even if you're making samurai, mutant virus samurai.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just that in the samurai game, you're like, yeah, we're good. No one's going to take this seriously, right?
Right.
If the more seriously someone, I mean, and this is part of the whole. I mean, these things are meant for usually, not always, but let's say usually meant for fun. And if you're doing fun in a context where you're not worried about people really taking you literally, this is not an obligation you need to worry about. But it really is still an obligation you have.
Right. Okay.
Right. You might say that you have an obligation. So that to me seems like the big one, but maybe also an obligation not to create unfounded fears in people. Maybe an obligation or responsibility to be sensitive to the fact that millions of people have lost family members. And
what would that mean? How would I have an obligation to be sensitive? But what is that?
Let's say not to make light of of those deaths, maybe. not to make those deaths trivial. Yeah, I don't know exactly. I think it's a good question. When we talked about 6 Days in Fallujah, right? This is kind of one of those things where you want to be respectful to the people who lost, like, let's say, loved ones. What it means to be respectful, I think, is a potentially complicated question that might be very context specific.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But certainly, like, making fun of the people that died,
Well, right.
would be the kind of thing would be like, wait, you're not really supposed to do that.
Right. No punching down. Let's not.
Right?
Let's don't punch down.
Don't punch down.
Always punch up.
And don't create. We have a responsibility not to create harm.
Right.
Right. I mean, unless there's no unnecessary harm being created. Right. And I would say the same for anything that is, let's say, intentionally socially divisive or something, right? You're just creating harm in this sense for no particular reason. Right. Okay, so let's say this is obviously an incomplete list of all this stuff. Let's say now we've got so at this point we got the facts, we got our stakeholders, we got the stakes, and the stakes are also the potential consequences, right? We got our rights and responsibilities, rights and obligations. The fifth step is options. Right, because every ethical decision is an ethical decision between different options.
Sure.
Right.
Even if it's do nothing or do the thing, it's still an option, right?
Right. Just those two. And one of the things about deciding about options is a lot of times people make the mistakes, and maybe this is the most common mistake, which is either we do it or we don't. And almost always there are other alternatives. Right. Almost always there's other options to consider. Right. So in this case, right, our options would run the gamut of don't do a game, right? So we could just start
make a
with
different
that.
game. Right?
Make a different game altogether, right? Or make a game, let's say, about a pandemic, but avoid COVID, right? Or make, let's say, one of several different types of games. Again, notice. Usually when we do this, it's more specific than simply making a game. But in this case, we can, once we've got this, notice already we've got this kind of setup that really helps us come up with ideas of what do we want to avoid, right? What do we want to do? So
let's assume that the premise of this is that we're going to make a game about COVID. We've been asked to, we've been paid to. We've agreed to do a game about COVID. Now we just need to figure out what kind of game it is.
Okay, so let's at this point kind of, let's say in our options, we might restrict ourselves to, are we going to try to make a serious game or just a silly game, right? Notice that would be a kind of easy one. And let's proceed with, let's say we're going to make a serious game because otherwise these things don't matter very much.
Right. Right.
Okay, so we're restricting our options already. So any game that's just going to be silly and fun, it means we're going to try to take this seriously, right? So we would then come up with several options, right? Several ways to do that. So one might be, let's say, the kind of simulation game, right? And if we come up, and again, we would probably want to, at this point, I think this would be, if I was really doing this, I think at this point, I would, before proceeding to options, I would get to the point where I would say, okay, now more specifically, what kind of game do we want to make?
Right. What kind of what do we want to achieve with this game? What's our high level goals?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And then like let's say if what we wanted is for people to understand the complexity of government decisions, right? Then if that's our goal, then probably we're going to go towards some sort of simulation games, but not necessarily. Maybe there's a narrative-driven game that might, so we could then talk about that, right? Those could be options, right? And if we wanted people to, let's say, understand the psychology of, I talked to, I had one of my best friends is a doctor. And last week, he lost, he had a woman with COVID. He's a critical care pulmonary physician, so he deals with COVID patients pretty much all the time. Yeah. He had a woman come in, about 30, who came in pregnant, who gave birth to a child that died from COVID, and then the next day or 2 days later died from COVID herself. And he was and he was just he was crying. It was so hard, and it's so hard to lose. And he was telling me how incredibly hard this pandemic has been on nurses and doctors dealing with it, right? And how they're paying triple pay to nurses because the stress, they just can't handle the stress. So notice, right? One possibility would be exploring the psychological burden of healthcare workers. Right. Or exploring the, what it is to be an immunocompromised person at in this kind of situation. Or right. So we have a bunch of options, right? We choose one. Which one of these would you like to kind of go with?
I'm always drawn to the ones that are the hardest. So exploring the psychological life of a nurse at a hospital.
Okay. Right.
Would be a huge challenge, but what an interesting challenge to dig into.
Yeah, and notice, right, if we were to do that, we'd probably go back and revise some of our stakeholders, right?
For sure.
We would add more relevant facts to this, right? The facts that are specific to nurses and in hospitals, as far as that goes. And as I said, these are kind of things where you kind of can go back and forth, especially during this awareness part. It might be that this is the kind of decision you would make in the beginning and then do this kind of step-by-step framework. Or it might be that you do the step-by-step framework and then you kind of see where things are, and then you're like, okay, interesting things to do with what I need to think about. Here's a bunch of them, and here's one I want to work with, like, let's say, working on a nurse-based game. Now let's go back and see, is there anything we missed that's going to be relevant? Right? We're going to need to get some statistics about this. We're going to need to do some research on it to talk about the burnout rate and all that kind of stuff.
That's right.
What nurses specifically do, different types of nurses.
Right. We should probably talk to some nurses, try to get some actual firsthand information about
firsthand information, firsthand stories, right? Again, think if there's any kind of special obligations, responsibilities we have, because now we're talking specifically about nurses. Yeah. Right. And not just nurses, but hospital workers, period. He was talking, the security guard was crying, or the nurses are crying. The security guard is consoling them. Right. Okay, then we think about kind of our options, right? So how can we make a game about about a nurse, right? And we don't need to think about these specific options right here, right? But notice, right? Presuming we're going to make a narrative-driven game, it doesn't have to be, right? Again, we can make a simulation where you're managing a hospital and you're dealing with this burnout rate, right?
Right. Although, I mean, even if you're making a simulation game, you still think about narrative. I mean, even that one we talked about, the Corona game.
It still has a storyline.
It has a storyline and has events that happen at specific moments.
Right.
So you still have to think about what is the story that we're telling, even in a simulationist game.
Right. And it's interesting, right? So how personal we're going to make it versus simulation might also involve how deeply we're getting into the story, right? It's interesting, giving how many simulation games there are out there and giving what we want to get to. So, so we think about our, let's say we have these two options already, right? Make a simulation game that works on this. Make a narrative-driven game where you play, let's say, a nurse manager or nurse administrator, or I forgot what they call the senior nurses, right? Right. Or maybe a hospital administrator dealing with the ICU wing of the hospital, right? Because you're not just dealing with nurses, you're also dealing with family members. Yeah. right? You're dealing with the patients themselves.
Right.
So okay, now we got, let's say, so you can be that, or you could be the nurse. Let's say we've got these 3 options plus the option of let's not make this game at all.
Right.
Right?
Let's do something else. Right.
Right. So this gives us 4 options, right?
Mhm.
And now the next thing is essentially you look at each option. For each option, essentially, how is it going to affect us, the stakeholders, right? How does it deal with the responsibilities that we have, right?
Right.
To each of the stakeholders involved. And once you've kind of got that down, right, you really can have. Notice how systematic this is, right?
Yeah.
You can really have a good snapshot of what you're getting with each one and how responsible it is, and maybe of what you would also need to do to make it more responsible to kind of fit it in with what you want to achieve.
Right.
And then the next step is step 6 is essentially balance, which is you ask yourself which is the best option, right? And that's a process of reasoning. And one of the nice things about it is you've already got the ideas about the impact that this option would have on different stakeholders, right? And on meeting your responsibilities, right? So you're comparing, you already have things to compare.
Right.
Right?
Right. So in game development, those of you who are listening about and thinking about where does this happen during the game development process? I would say that this happens early in the process when you're first creating your touchstone document. Like,
oh, yeah.
This is what this game is going to be. This is what this game is going to be about. This is what we're trying to achieve with this game. All of these things this is all work you would need to do ahead of creating that touchstone document.
Yeah. Oh,
or in the
definitely.
process of creating the touchstone document. This might be an iterative process, just creating the touchstone document where you're like, all right, I think this is what the touchstone is. Let's do the work and find out whether this is what we actually want it to be.
So that's step 6, right? You've come to a conclusion about which one is the best, right? After looking at all this stuff. But we normally add a step 7 and 8.
Oh.
And essentially coming to a conclusion is often not enough. This is partly because, I come to this from the world of business ethics originally and medical ethics after that, where it's one thing to think about doing the right thing. It's another thing to actually, convince people to do the right thing.
Right.
Right. So, acting part is not easy. Right. So the third part of this, step 7, 8, is essentially courage. So strategies for so the first thing is identifying potential obstacles that could stand in your way, right? For example, you want to do this in a way that you think is responsible, but you think your investors are going to say, well, no, this will make us more money, right? What do that's an obstacle to you essentially doing what you think is ethical.
Sure.
Or you want to not misinform the public, but you're not really sure yourself what the right information is. Yeah. Right? That's an obstacle.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Or at least a risk.
But if you want to do it right, it's, they're all risks in some sense.
Right. So interestingly, when I worked at THQ's process included, for the producers of the game, to create a risk assessment document. And I've never seen it done anywhere else. And I think it was a great idea, where they list off every possible risk that might happen, from the mundane to the theoretical.
Okay.
To the conceptual, right?
Right.
And then steps that they would do if this risk came up, if this ended up being a problem. What steps would you take to ameliorate the risk?
Yeah, and that's pretty much very much this idea. And notice, right, in business, it makes anytime you have a business, right, and you've got some sort of strategy for doing something, you want to be aware of these things, and you want to have a plan, right?
Yeah,
which is step 8, right? Step 8 is essentially having a plan.
Oh, okay. Right.
Having a strategy for dealing with these things.
So the risk
Right.
assessment, and then and then here's what we would do in case this comes to pass.
Right. Very commonly, more commonly in the situations that my students have them, is a situation where you have to sell this to your bosses,
Right.
right? Or you have to sell this to the team, right?
Right.
As you kind of thought this out. So how are you going to do that, right? You don't just want to present it for, because ethics doesn't mean anything if you can't get it off it still means something, but
Right.
if you can't actually act on it, it means so much less.
That's right.
So you want successful action, and that means having that risk assessment and looking at potential obstacles and planning for them.
That's right. So presumably your team and your boss have probably been involved in this all the way through. So you probably don't have to worry too much about them, because they've been involved in you have kept them involved in the process of creating this initial document, this initial touchstone document.
Maybe, it depends. It depends how you're doing. Or maybe this is just you've been asked to do a game.
Yeah.
Right? And you have some qualms about this game, and you decide, I'm going to sit down and kind of think this out.
Yeah.
Right? And you spend a half hour like we have, or you probably do a little bit, hopefully more, because you get more specifics.
Right.
Right? And you spend, that time kind of focusing on it, and then you're ready to kind of communicate that to other people.
Yeah.
Right? So it can go in a bunch of different ways.
So going back to to wrap it up then, going back to these games about the coronavirus games, how many of them do you think went through some process like this?
I don't know. Certainly a step-by-step process like this, my guess would be none.
Okay.
They
might have their own processes for having made similar decisions.
I think certainly
the simulation game probably more so than
Yes, I think the simulation game essentially, they, at least with the two I looked at, they definitely thought of, one of them donates part of the profits to the World Health Organization. Another one, this idea of transparency and telling the people that this isn't realistic, and this is the best we can do given the information we have. I think all those are kind of conscious attempts to take responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say overall, the smarter thing to do would be to go through a step-by-step process, just like with everything else, right? Anytime you want to make a smart business decision, you would go through a step-by-step process, a systematic process to make sure you're not leaving things out. And I think the same would be in this trying to make a good ethical decision. And again, this idea of, and just to go kind of through it again, right? Get the relevant facts, right? Figure out the stakeholders, who's going to be impacted, and stakes, how could they be impacted? Think about what are the rights that people involved have, or entities involved have. What are the responsibilities, right, involved here? What are your options?
Mm-hmm.
Which of those options is the best?
Right.
And why? And that why? And you should be able to articulate very clearly why. And best always means better than the other options, not just good. Right.
Right.
What are potential obstacles to executing this well? And what are your strategies for doing this? And you can think that through any ethical decision about anything at all, and go do the right thing and do it in a way that's actually effective.
Right. And so I think in closing, I think we can say that it's not unethical to make a game about a tragedy, even if you're making it in the middle of the tragedy. It's just a matter of how you go about handling it, and being sensitive to all of these things, and being sensitive to all the people that are stakeholders and all the ways that you might harm them.
I wouldn't say that's the point that I would be making, but I agree with you.
Okay.
I think there's nothing we can't make a game about.
Right.
But that some things can be much, much harder to make games about than others, especially serious games.
Oh, yes,
and we talked
sure.
again. This is where we talked about 6 Days in Fallujah, right?
Yeah.
Quite a bit. And a process like this can be incredibly helpful in thinking those kinds of things through.
Right.
Okay, that's it, Andy.
Good
Good
podcast.
podcast. GP. Play nice, everybody.